You know, it's really amazing to see how fast these large language models are evolving.
Yeah.
Like, we're seeing models like DeepSeek R1 now. They're not just generating text anymore. They're actually tackling
Right.
30. Some really complex problems, and it really looks like genuine reasoning, but the huge question that researchers are trying to grapple with is how,
Totally.
like, what's going on inside these neural networks that lets them do this kind of thought process. So today we are diving into some really cool cutting-edge research that's starting to give us a peek under the hood.
Absolutely. And the paper that we're looking at today is I have covered all the bases here.
Oh, wow.
Interpreting reasoning features in LLMs via sparse autoencoders.
Okay.
By Galichin and his colleagues. And I love that even the title of the paper is I have covered all the bases here.
Right.
It's almost like this declaration.
Like the model's saying it.
Exactly. Right after it's done some like really thorough reasoning process.
Yeah.
And their core innovation is they're using this technique called sparse autoencoders to try and pinpoint the actual internal components that are responsible for this reasoning ability.
I have covered all the bases here. Yeah. It's quite telling.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. Sparse autoencoders, or SAEs.
Yeah.
For you, the listener, just think of this as like a special tool that we can use to kind of dissect the incredibly complex inner workings of an LLM.
Absolutely.
So how do SAEs let us identify these reasoning features?
So the real innovation here is using SAEs for interpretability.
Okay.
So imagine an LLM like this massive circuit board with billions of connections.
Yeah.
What an SAE does is it acts like a microscope
that
can zoom in and identify the crucial subcircuits that are most active.
Got it.
When the model is quote unquote thinking.
Okay.
And so it learns this compressed representation of the vast amount of data that's flowing through these internal layers of the LLM.
Okay.
And what's really important is it's a sparse representation.
Okay.
And that's key because that forces the SAE to focus on the most important signals.
I see.
It's kind of like if you were reading a long document and you were only allowed to highlight the key sentences, the ones that really conveyed the main ideas.
Okay, so it's not about capturing every single detail.
Right.
It's about finding the most important mechanisms at play.
It's about finding the essence of what's going on.
So how did the researchers actually apply these sparse autoencoders to find these reasoning features within an LLM?
So they trained an SAE on the DeepSeek R1 Llama 8B model, focusing specifically on the 19th layer of the network.
19th layer? That sounds pretty deep.
Yeah, so think of the layers of the network, like different stages of processing. Right, so as you go deeper into the network, you're getting into more and more abstract representations of the information. And the 19th layer is pretty deep in there, suggesting it's involved in these more kind of abstract and higher level things. Now, the data they used to train the SAE was really important. They used two large data sets. One was called LMS Chat 1M, which is this massive data set of just general conversation.
So just general language.
Exactly, just general language. And that helps the SAE learn what quote unquote normal language looks like inside the model.
Got it.
But then a second data set they used was really crucial, and that's called OpenThoughts 114K. And this data set is super interesting because it actually contains these high-quality reasoning traces that were generated by DeepSeek R1 itself.
I see.
When it was solving these complex problems.
So it's reasoning about reasoning.
Exactly. And by training the SAE on both this general language data and the reasoning-specific data, they were able to isolate the internal signals that are really associated with this problem-solving process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the 19th layer, very deep, and then using reasoning-specific data to train the SAE. That seems like a very targeted approach.
Absolutely.
Were there any particular aspects of how they trained the SAE that are noteworthy from a technical perspective?
Absolutely. So they used what's called a relay-U activation function, which is essentially a simple on-off switch for the internal components.
Got it.
Right. It helps the model decide which signals are important to pass on and which ones to kind of ignore. More interestingly, they set what's called an expansion factor of 16. Now, what this means is the SAE's hidden layer, which is where it actually learns these sparse features, was 16 times bigger than the input layer.
Oh, wow.
This is called overcompleteness. And it's really cool because it gives the SAE more room to discover a wider range of potentially subtle reasoning signals. Kind of like if you have a microscope with a higher resolution.
I see.
You can see finer details.
That makes sense.
Right. And so they're giving the SAE this high resolution view of the model's internal state.
Okay.
Now, they also applied something called an L1 sparsity loss with a parameter called beta, and they set that to 5.
Okay.
And what this does is it acts like a penalty.
Okay.
That forces the SAE to be really selective.
I see.
It says, hey, you can only highlight the absolutely essential features.
Okay.
Don't get bogged down in all these little details.
Got it. So forcing it to really focus on the most important features.
And the result is a really high degree of sparsity.
Okay.
Like around 78% of the features were inactive on the general chat data.
Wow.
And 94% were inactive on the reasoning data.
Wow, that's a very high percentage.
Yeah, it's super sparse, and that's really important.
Okay.
Because that sparsity allows these potentially interpretable features to emerge.
Okay, so we've got this SAE that is trained to identify these sparse features within DeepSeek ISAR1, specifically when it's engaged in reasoning.
Yeah.
But how do we differentiate like general language features from actual reasoning features?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, and this is where reason score comes into play.
Exactly.
So for the listener out there, this is the method that the researchers came up with to actually pinpoint which internal neurons are most activated when the model is actually thinking.
Totally. So their hypothesis was that if a feature is truly involved in reasoning, then it should be super active when the LLM is processing or generating language. That is indicative of thought.
Got it.
And they were inspired by how humans actually engage in what's called exploratory talk. When we're problem solving, you know, we often use words that signal uncertainty or reflection or investigation.
So we're kind of thinking out loud.
Exactly. And so they wanted to look for similar linguistic fingerprints.
Oh, that's interesting.
Within the LLM's output.
So they're looking for the LLM's version of maybe, or because...
Exactly, yeah. Like, what are the words that the LLM is using that tell us that it's really thinking hard about this problem?
So how did they actually go about creating this reasoning vocabulary?
So they used this really clever method. They compared the frequency of words in 2 different sets of math solutions that were taken from the OpenThoughts data set. One set contained the final answers, you know, just like the equation or the number. And the other set contained the really detailed step-by-step reasoning processes that DeepSeek R1 generated.
So one is just the answer. One is the whole thought process.
Exactly. And by comparing these 2 sets of solutions, they could identify the words that were much more common when the LLM was actually explaining its reasoning.
I see.
And to make sure they were focusing on words that were really specific to the LLM's reasoning, they filtered out super common words from the Google Books Ngram data.
Got it.
And so they ended up with this set of the top 10 words that were really indicative of this thinking process, and that became their reasoning vocabulary. So it was this data-driven way to define what constitutes reasoning language.
Yeah, that's really smart. So they have this vocabulary now. How does the reason score help them identify which SAE features are the relevant ones?
So the reason score for a given feature essentially tells you how much more that feature lights up. Or activates on tokens that belong to this reasoning vocabulary compared to its activation on all the other tokens.
Got it.
So they basically calculate the average activation of the feature on the reasoning words. And separately on the non-reasoning words.
Got it.
They normalize these averages by the total activation across all the features. And then the difference between those normalized activations gives you an initial score. But then they add this really important component, which is the entropy penalty.
Why is that important?
Because they realize that some features might activate really strongly on just 1 or 2 words from the reasoning vocabulary. But then be totally silent on all the others.
Got it.
And so to make sure that they were identifying reasoning features that were more broadly relevant to the idea of reasoning, they introduced this entropy penalty, which is higher for features that activate in a really uneven way across the vocabulary.
So it has to be consistent across the...
Exactly. It can't just be like, oh, this one feature really loves the word, maybe, but it doesn't care about any of the other reasoning words. So the entropy penalty penalizes those features.
Got it.
And favors the ones that show a more consistent pattern of activation across all the reasoning words.
So it has to care about all the reasoning words.
Exactly. It has to be a general reasoning feature, not just a feature for a specific word.
So the reason score takes this activation difference and then combines it with this entropy weighting.
Exactly. So it's a way to rank all these internal components by how much they care about reasoning-related language.
So they calculate the reason score for all the features that the SAE learned. What's the next step?
So then they took the top 100 features with the highest reason scores.
Yeah.
And they manually evaluated each one.
Oh, wow.
Using this custom interface.
That's a lot of manual work.
It was a lot of work, but it was really important
Okay.
because they wanted to ground this automated metric in actual human interpretability.
Okay.
So they wanted to see, okay, what are these features actually doing?
Yeah.
When they activate, what kind of context are they activating in?
Okay.
And what impact are they having on the model's predictions?
So going beyond just the numbers, looking at...
Yeah, looking at the actual text, looking at what the model is doing.
Got it.
And they define specific criteria for what they considered to be good reasoning candidates.
Okay.
So things like, does the feature activate consistently in logical context?
Okay.
Or in contexts that involve uncertainty or causality?
Yeah.
Does it have a clear impact on what they call the reasoning-related logits?
Logits, for the listener, these are the raw scores.
Exactly.
That the model assigns to all the different...
To the different possible words that it could say next.
Yeah.
And so by looking at the logits that a feature influences, you can see, okay, what kind of vocabulary is this feature associated with?
I see.
Is it associated with reasoning words or is it associated with something else?
Got it.
And then the third thing they looked at was, does the feature activate across different types of reasoning tasks?
So it's not just good at math problems. It's
exactly.
good at other types of reasoning as well.
It's a general reasoning feature, not a math-specific feature.
Okay, so they do all this manual analysis to validate the top 100 features?
Yes.
Now they have a set of really promising reasoning features.
Right.
But how do we know that they're actually causing the reasoning way?
Right.
And not just correlated with it?
Yeah, that's where the fun begins.
Right. This is where feature steering comes in. Exactly. So feature steering is the technique that they use to really establish causality. So it's not just correlation, it's causation.
Exactly. We want to show that these features are not just hanging out when the model is reasoning.
Right.
We want to show that they're actually responsible for it.
So it's not just that they're there when the reasoning is happening.
Right.
They're actually causing it to happen.
Exactly. They're driving the bus.
Okay, so how do they actually do this tiering?
So for each of these candidate reasoning features, they first figure out, okay, what is the normal activation range for this feature? You know, when the model is just doing its thing.
Right.
And then during text generation, they would go in and actually modify the model's internal activations.
Oh, wow.
By adding a scaled version of what's called the features decoding vector.
Okay.
This is something that the SAE learned to the original activation.
Okay.
And the scaling factor, which is denoted by the Greek letter lambda, controls the strength of this intervention.
So you can turn it up or turn it down.
Exactly. So positive values of lambda would amplify the feature's influence. And negative values would suppress it. Okay. So you can imagine it like a volume knob.
Got it.
You can turn up the reasoning feature.
So you can crank up the reasoning?
Exactly. Or you can turn it down and see what. Now, the cool thing here is that unlike a lot of earlier work on steering, which often focused on just like stylistic changes in the text, this work was specifically focused on steering reasoning-related attributes.
So things like forming causal links.
Exactly. So things like causal links, deductive inference, structured argumentation.
So the really high-level reasoning tasks?
Exactly, the stuff that we care about.
Okay.
And so they systematically varied the steering.
Okay.
And then they meticulously analyzed the resulting text to see what happened.
So they're cranking the knob up and down.
Yeah.
And they're seeing what happens to the output.
Exactly what happens to the model's reasoning.
Okay, so how do they actually evaluate whether the steering voice is having the effect that they want it to have?
So they use a combination of human inspection, you know, good old-fashioned reading and analysis.
Yeah.
And then they also use the incredible power of GPT-4ao.
GPT-4o, wow.
Yeah, for automated evaluation.
So using AI who evaluate AI.
Exactly. It's AI all the way down.
Wow, okay.
And so Table 2 in their paper actually summarizes all of the different reasoning clusters that they identified through the steering process.
So these are groups of features that when you steer them,
yeah,
they seem to influence specific aspects of reasoning.
Exactly. So for example, they found a cluster of features that when they were steered, seemed to influence the depth and thoroughness of the reasoning. And another cluster that influenced numerical accuracy and validation.
Got it.
And yet another cluster that influenced self-correction and backtracking.
So this is really cool.
It's super cool, right? And Table 3 in their paper actually provides some really compelling examples of how strengthening or weakening these features actually leads to tangible changes in the model's output.
So you can actually see the reasoning becoming more or less detailed or...
Exactly. You can see the reasoning change
Yeah.
in a way that's consistent with what you're doing with the steering.
And this is all summarized in their paper?
It's all in the paper, and there are some really amazing examples.
Okay, so this is really showing that the features aren't just correlated, they're actually causing these changes in reasoning.
They're driving the changes. They're not just passengers.
Okay, so beyond just these kind of qualitative examples, did they actually test?
Yes, they did.
This on any benchmark datasets?
Absolutely. So to really validate these findings, they applied this feature steering technique to some really challenging reasoning-intensive benchmarks. Like the AIM 2024.
The AIM?
Yes, the American Invitational Mathematics Examination.
Oh, wow.
It's a really hard math competition for high school students. And then they also use Math 500 and GPQA, Diamond.
So these are all very challenging.
These are tough problem-solving tasks that require a lot of reasoning power.
And what happened when they did the feature steering on these benchmark datasets?
So the results were super consistent and really compelling. Table 1 in their paper actually shows that steering these identified reasoning features generally led to an increase in the average number of tokens that the model produced before it arrived at the final answer.
So it's producing more tokens?
It's producing more tokens, which suggests that it's engaging in more expensive internal thought processes or steps.
So it's thinking more?
It's thinking more deeply. It's not jumping to the answer.
That's really interesting.
And even more importantly, for certain features, they actually observed an improvement in accuracy measured by what's called the pass-at-one metric. And this improvement was consistent across all 3 benchmarks.
So not only is it thinking more, it's actually getting the right answer.
Exactly. It's thinking more effectively, and it's getting more answers, right?
Wow.
Now, Appendix B of the paper has some really insightful examples of how this actually plays out in practice. One example is this question: how many R's are in the word strawberry?
How many R's are on the word strawberry?
Yeah, and when they steered a particular reasoning feature, the model actually produced this much more detailed step-by-step self-reflective reasoning process.
It sounds like it's almost thinking out loud.
It really does. It's like, okay, let me think about this. Let me count the letters.
Wow.
Let me make sure I didn't miss any.
And this is all in the paper?
It's all in the paper, and there are tons of other examples, too, for different problem types.
So not just strawberries.
Not just strawberries, all sorts of delicious reasoning problems.
So it seems like this research is providing very strong support for their claim that these features are involved in reasoning.
This is like groundbreaking stuff. This is the first time that we have this really clear mechanistic evidence linking specific interpretable components inside these super complex neural networks to actual sophisticated reasoning behavior.
So we're not just looking at the outputs, we're looking
inside the black box.
Under the hood.
We're cracking it open and seeing how the gears turn.
Wow.
And this is a huge deal for the field of AI interpretability.
So for you, the listener, this is not just about understanding AI as it is now.
Right.
This is about understanding how we might interact with it in the future.
Absolutely.
And even potentially improve these systems.
Yeah, so what are the big implications of these findings?
Yeah, what are the implications?
I think the implications are profound.
Okay.
It shows that we can combine these really sophisticated interpretability techniques like sparse autoencoders with these targeted intervention methods like feature steering to really open up the black box of LLMs.
Yeah.
And by identifying and understanding these reasoning features, we might be able to develop AI systems that are more controllable and more transparent.
Yeah.
Imagine being able to fine-tune specific reasoning abilities
Right.
or diagnose the root causes of errors
by
actually examining the feature activations or even enhance reasoning capabilities through these targeted interventions that encourage the activation of beneficial reasoning features.
So we can make the AIs better reasoners.
Potentially, yes. We can give them a little boost in the right direction.
That's incredible.
It's super exciting, and it paves the way for this much deeper, more mechanistic understanding of AI cognition.
It's almost like we're starting to decode thought.
Yeah, we're getting closer to understanding the language of thought.
That's amazing. And if we can identify these reasoning features and we can even potentially influence them, that really raises a ton of fascinating questions about where AI is going.
Totally.
And how we relate to it.
What does it mean to understand AI? What does it mean to control AI?
And this research really just opens up a whole world of possibilities. For future exploration.
It's like a new frontier.
So for the listener out there, if you are eager to dive deeper into this,
please do.
The paper's called I Have Covered All the Bases Here.
Yeah, it's a great read.
Interpreting Reasoning Features and LLMs via Sparse Autoencoders. And it's a really fascinating read.
And it just shows that our journey to fully understand AI is just beginning.
We are just at the start.
Yeah.
Well said. And until our next deep dive into the fascinating world of AI.
I'll see you then.
I'll see you then.